Let's go ahead and hit record so that the kids at home can get an idea for what we got going on. I want to share my screen to show y'all the week at a glance. And I posted this for Mr. Johnson's kids as well. So it's the same thing. So today we're going to do like a very short intro on the cell cycle. My kids, you were assigned cell cycle vocabulary. Tomorrow is an amnesty day. And so what this means is, y'all ready for this? I'm giving everyone a free day. So tomorrow will be your opportunity to get yourselves caught up. If you have missing work, get it done. If you have done everything that you need to do and you need to take a mental health day, you do you, boo, like you've earned it. Okay. There is 10th graders on campus. So unless you are taking the PSAT, if you are an in-person student, do not show up tomorrow. They only want the students that are taking the PSAT. They do have some freshmen that are taking it tomorrow. So if that's one of you, good luck. If that does not apply to you, don't act brand new. Stay home. Okay? On Wednesday, we're on the modified schedule because we have early release. So we're going to have an activity of some sorts. And unless Mr. Johnson texted me back, I think I might still have y'all. Yeah, he didn't say. So let's just assume that I still have y'all on Wednesday. Because let's be real, y'all don't want to go back yet. And then on Thursday, we'll come back. We'll talk about a little bit more in depth mitosis with the PMAT, and we'll look at pictures and we'll be able to identify each phase. And then on Friday, we'll start introducing cancer. Now, today's notes are like super bare. They're the big picture. We're not getting into a whole lot of detail. We're going to watch a very short Amoeba Sisters video, and then we'll take our notes kind of like we've been doing. And you'll have about 15, 20 minutes left at the end of class. We're all good with that? Sweet. So I've had that Dua Lipa song stuck in my head like all weekend. That levitating song, I cannot get it out of my head. Oh my gosh, let's let Casey in. I want the cell cycle one. No. Well, let's try this again. YouTube. I am struggling a little bit. Technology is just, it's doing me dirty right now. It was working just fine, but then it decided to act brand new.
Have you ever been sitting in class and thought to yourself, I wonder what my skin cells are doing right now at this very moment?
Never.
This kind of pondering may be unique to me, maybe. But wouldn't we at some point wonder what our cells are doing right now? Because if you remember, as part of the cell theory, you are made of cells. All living things are made of one or more cells. Many multicellular organisms like you have cells that work together, working together as part of a body tissue, body tissues working together as part of an organ, organs working together as part of an organ system. Your cells are specialized to work in these different levels of organization. You have skin cells, stomach cells, muscle cells, just to name a few, and their functions need to be regulated. These cells actually are regulated as part of something called the cell cycle. And that is going to relate to my question of, I wonder what my cells are doing right now. Cells themselves can grow in size, but let's put it in perspective now. A multicellular organism isn't growing because each individual cell is getting bigger. A multicellular organism itself grows by making more cells, by the cells making more cells by dividing. That's cell reproduction. One reason that you're bigger than you were when you were five, unless you are five, is because your cells have divided to make more cells. Mitosis and the cytokinesis that follows that splits the cytoplasm allows you to make new body cells. But you don't want that cell division happening all the time. Why? It is likely that you've heard the term cancer before. We have had family members that have battled cancer before. It is definitely a relevant topic for all of us. Cancer is in part due to cells that divide too frequently. The cells are not regulated, they are uncontrolled. Cancer cells can have other problems too. They might not be able to communicate with other healthy cells. They may not be able to carry out normal cell functions. They may not securely anchor themselves like other cells do, which can make them more likely to travel somewhere else. Some cancer cells have the ability to secrete their own growth hormone that makes blood vessels divert over to those cancer cells and supply the cancer cell with nutrients, which can take nutrients away from healthy cells. Why do cancer cells become this way? Well, there's a lot of research in this area. With some cancers, there may be genetic links, making some cells more susceptible to having problems. These genetic factors might run in families. Exposure to toxins, radiation, excessive exposure to UV light, all of these can be risk factors for some cells to become cancerous. The uncontrolled growth that cancer cells have gives rise to more cells like them, which can develop into a tumor. Some tumors stay put, but some do not. Now, the good news is that scientists continue to develop better treatments, which include destroying the cancer cells with radiation or medication, such as chemotherapy, which will target cells that divide frequently. Maybe someday you will be part of helping to meet the challenge of trying to eliminate cancer, because the fact remains that these cells are not participating in the cell cycle like they should. So, what is the cell cycle? The cell cycle is often represented as a pie chart like this. Cells are either in one of two different phases: a phase called interphase, where the cells themselves are growing, replicating their DNA, doing their cell functions, or they are in M phase, which includes mitosis and the actual splitting of the cytoplasm, cytokinesis. So, this M phase is where cells actually divide to make more cells, but cells spend most of their time in interphase. So most of the time, they're not dividing. Now, depending on what kind of cell, it might do mitosis more or less often. For example, your hair follicle cells do mitosis frequently, which is why your hair can grow at the rate that it does. It's also why many cancer drugs may also target hair follicle cells, because many cancer drugs go after cells that do cell division frequently. It's a big deal for cells to hit this M phase. If a cell has an error, a harmful mutation, for example, you do not want it to divide, because then it will create another cell that has this same issue. That's where checkpoints come in handy. Along the cell cycle, there are checkpoints to check that the cell is growing well and replicating its DNA correctly and doing everything it's supposed to do correctly before it divides. To better understand those checkpoints, let's further divide this cell cycle pie chart. We have G1, S, G2. All three of those are part of interphase. Then we have M phase, where mitosis will happen. During G1, the cell individually itself grows. Then it replicates its DNA in S phase. You can remember that because the S is for synthesis, which means to make something, and it's making DNA. Then G2, the cell grows some more in preparation for mitosis. So let's take a look at checkpoints. We've got one here in G1. This checkpoint checks, is the cell growing well enough? Is its DNA damaged? because if it is, you definitely don't want it to move on to S phase where it would replicate DNA. Does the cell have the resources it needs if it were to keep moving on? This checkpoint in G2 checks if the DNA was replicated correctly back in S phase. Is it growing well enough? Does it have the resources it needs to continue? Okay, then moving on. This next checkpoint in M phase is my favorite checkpoint. It checks in the stage metaphase to make sure the chromosomes, which are made of DNA, are lined up in the middle correctly, that they're all attached to the spindle correctly, because if they're not, the chromosomes will not be separated correctly. So now you may have two big questions. First, what happens if the cell doesn't meet the requirements of the checkpoint? And second, what is doing the regulating of this cycle anyway? To address the first question, if the reason the cell can't go past the checkpoint is a reason that can be fixed, the cell may kind of pause here until it can fix that issue. But if it can't be fixed, then the cell does something called apoptosis, which basically means the cell self-destructs. This ensures that a cell that is damaged beyond repair will not go on to divide. So what is doing the regulating anyway? We've mentioned before that proteins are a big deal. Genes in your body can code for proteins that do an assortment of functions, and there are many proteins involved with regulating the cell cycle. Some of them are positive regulators because they allow moving forward in the cycle, and some are negative regulators that might make things stop. The proteins themselves can be sensitive to cues inside and outside of the cell. So, for example, two proteins that are involved in positive regulation are cyclin and CDK. CDK is specifically an enzyme protein, a fancy kind called a kinase, which is worth a Google. CDK can have different forms of cyclin protein bound to it. Different types of cyclin rise and fall throughout the cell cycle, and the rising and falling is based on a variety of signals to determine when the cell should move on to the next cell cycle phase. Typically, each cell cycle phase, G1, S, G2, M, will tend to have a different cyclin binding with the CDK. The rise and fall of cyclin types and the role CDK has when it's active is a fascinating subject to explore. Remember that vocabulary word we said, apoptosis? Proteins that are negative regulators, for example, a protein called P53, can be involved in initiating apoptosis. Again, we encourage you to explore beyond the video. One last thing to mention. There are some cells that don't go through the phases we mentioned because they're actually in G0. That's a 0, by the way, and not an O, because if it was an O, then it's a go, and G0 is kind of the opposite of that. G0 is a resting phase. Now, cells here are still performing cell functions, but they're not preparing to divide. Some cells go here temporarily, maybe if there's not enough resources around, for example. But some, like many types of neurons in your brain and spinal cord, may stay here permanently. If they stay here permanently, they'll never get to M phase, so they will not divide. This can be one reason why a major injury to the brain or spinal cord can have challenges with healing, as many of those cells may not be able to replicate. A topic that definitely continues to be researched. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to.
Okay, so let me go ahead and turn on the second camera so we can take our notes. Now, again, today's notes are like super Mickey Mouse. Like we're basically creating an outline, and then as we talk about them, we're going to go a little further in depth with interphase, a little further in depth with mitosis, and then we're definitely going to finish off the week with cancer. All right, so the cell cycle. First and foremost, why must we make new cells? Well, there's actually two reasons. When you are growing and when you are repairing. So as small children, you are constantly undergoing these periods of rapid cell growth. Um, my boys in high school, especially because by the time that my girls get to high school, um, your hormones have already taken over. And so at this point, you have essentially started to calcify your growth plates because your body is now more focused on making a baby rather than growing to be 6'4". My boys enter puberty after the girls do. And so they still have a couple of growth spurts throughout high school. And you'll see a big one either the summer from 8th grade to freshman year or freshman year to sophomore year. You'll see really big growth spurts. We leave for the summer and we say, see you next year. But really, what we mean is we'll see each other in 3 months. And within those 3 months, like I have had boys come back and they like now have a beard and they've grown like 4 inches. That is a ridiculous amount of growth in a very short period of time. Now, typically during these periods of growth, you are going to see an increase in appetite. So you'll want to eat the whole house and you're going to have these periods of sleep. So you're going to want to just like nap all day. And that's because growing takes a lot of work. And so if your body is doing all this work trying to make like new muscle cells, new skin cells, new bone cells, etc., you are going to want to sleep the whole time. And in my children, I see this through their cycles. My 4-year-old is the size of an average 8-year-old. And so he will go through periods about every like 3 to 4 months where he's going through growth spurts and like he wants to eat the whole pantry. He cannot get enough of the applesauce and goldfish, etc. And he's just snacking. But it doesn't stay like that consistently. It'll stay like that throughout a growth spurt, and then he'll taper off, and then he'll basically go back to like being normal. And then in 3-4 months, he's doing that again. And so it's pretty cyclical. And if you have small siblings, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. They'll get really, really chubby, and then they'll stretch, and they'll look really skinny again, and then they'll get chubby, and it's like this vicious cycle. Growing eventually stops. So for me, I stopped growing at some point around 7th grade, right? And so to think that I've been the same height for more than half of my life is a little ridiculous. But the fact of the matter is that I still have cells that are growing within me. Just because I'm not growing in height doesn't mean that I'm not growing. My hair grows constantly, my nails grow constantly. So these cells are still undergoing growth, and that's why we talk about it. And when we talk about cancer, we're going to talk about like why you're more prone to losing your hair during like chemotherapy, etc. But that's for later this week. Now, in repair, we get this all the time. You get a paper cut, or you burn yourself curling your hair in the morning, or you are playing football and you get some road rash, or my son, like I told you, he's very, very big, so he's very, very clumsy. We got him a little scooter. He's constantly wiping out on that thing, so he's always got little bumps and bruises everywhere, and so his body is having to repair those cells, and that's completely normal. Now, when it gets to be a little dangerous is when the body starts making cells that are not needed for one of these 2 reasons. If the body just makes cells just for the heck of making cells, those cells are going to accumulate in clusters that we refer to as tumors. Now, tumors can be good or bad. Well, not good. They could be harmless or bad. And so we'll talk about like a malignant tumor versus a benign tumor. Again, that's later this week. Cell division. The purpose of this whole thing, let me put it in a different color. Cell division is going to produce 2 identical daughter cells. Now, in order for me to have 2 identical daughter cells, DNA must be replicated before the cells divide. Now, the cell cycle is basically described so it's going to grow and it's going to prepare for division. These are some key words we're going to want to keep in mind. Now the 3 steps. Step 1 is interphase. Step 2 is mitosis, which we're going to remember by using PMAT. And the final step is cytokinesis. It's really important to note that this process occurs soma means body. So your somatic cells are body cells. Now, this does not take place in your gametes. Your gametes are going to be your sperm and your egg. Those are your sex cells used for reproduction. All right, so now let's very, very briefly talk about these 3 steps, and then that's all that we got going on for today. So let's begin with interphase. Interphase is the longest and the reason that interphase is the longest phase is because Growing takes time. Now there's 3 components to interphase. There's G1, S, G2. I always tell myself G equals growth. And again, when you're asked to justify why is interphase the longest phase of the cell cycle, because if 2 of your 3 steps you're growing takes a long time. Some of you are not done growing and like you're 15 years old. 15 years is a long time. So in G1, we are growing. In S, this stands for synthesis, which means to make. That's why photosynthesis we make from the light. And what we are making is basically DNA. We're making copies of DNA. And then in G2, we move, Larson. It's like the stinking motion detectors over there. Oh my gosh, it took forever to finish growth. Prepares for cell division. So that's interphase. Our second step is mitosis. Now we are going to spend majority of Wednesday and Thursday talking about mitosis. Mitosis is defined as the division of the nucleus. Remember it using PMAT. The third is going to be cytokinesis, which is the so mitosis is division of the nucleus, cytokinesis division of the cells. And the prefix cyto pertains to cytoplasm. Kinesis means movement. So this is literally the movement of the cytoplasm so that it can split. The end Now we can also just throw in here just very briefly that cancer is uncontrolled cell growth. It's a disease of the cell cycle. And the thing with cancer is that cancer doesn't run in families. What actually runs in families is crappy cells that are prone to breaking down and not following through the checkpoints. And then therefore they make cells that are not required that again accumulate into clusters that we refer to as tumors, etc. Okay, so this is the big idea of what we're going to dive into next. How do we feel about this? I will post a picture of these notes in Schoology. But that's all we got going on for today. Please make sure that you do your attendance form and that you get yourself caught up on any missing work. Tomorrow, again, is an amnesty day. It is PSAT day at school. Do not show up for in-person unless you are unless you're taking the PSAT. And there is not going to be anything assigned. So if you're all caught up, take tomorrow as your mental health day. All right, kids. Other than that, you're free to go. Bye-bye. Bye, Sienna. Bye, Tiana. Bye, Nathaniel. Bye, Jared. Happy belated. Bye, Nicholas Vance.